Hello, everyone. I want to do a review of the week 3 study questions on Sighart and Downey. Number 1, what is Sighart's basic relationship-based theory of ethics? It's important to note in in Sighart's essay on professions as conscience of society, he doesn't start with a theory of professional ethics. He starts with a theory of ethics, a more basic grounding for things, and then he moves on. So what is his actual theory, his basic theory of ethics, which is relationship-based? I think you can go to the text here and see what he says. This is in the bottom of the first page, the second column. Questions of morality and ethics can only arise for a human individual in the context of a relationship with some other entity. That is, that ethics is really about relations. You have to have more than one party involved. And he keeps it very basic there, very general, in saying the relationship between a human individual and some other entity, leaving open the idea that you might have ethical relations with animals or other creatures, imaginary creatures, I don't know, or even things. But he pretty much says he's going to leave off that idea and just stick with the traditional idea that, as he says, this is on page 118, the second paragraph of the first column, for practical purposes, almost all our moral problems pose themselves in the context of interpersonal relationships. That is, relations with other human beings. So the basic theory of ethics he has here is that for an ethical situation to arise, a necessary condition is there must be some sort of relationship, some sort of relation between two human beings. Where am I here? Number 2, explain the importance of the choice between selfishness and altruism in Sighart's theory of ethics. It shouldn't have a question mark at the end there. I don't know why. That is not a question. So sorry for the sloppy punctuation. There, we're getting into the next really sort of specification in his general theory of ethics. And that is, ethical situations don't always arise in relations between human beings. They're a particular type of situation. And just because you have a relation between two human beings, it doesn't mean you have an ethical situation. This is at the bottom of the first column on page 118, where he says, refers to his next elementary proposition, which is that interpersonal moral problems only present themselves to an individual when his or her interests come into conflict with the interests of another, which is to say that ethical situations have to be a relation, let's say a relation between human beings, but that relation has to be in a situation where there's a conflict of interests between the two parties. He continues and says, moral problems do not arise in a paradise of abundance where all wishes can be instantly gratified without anyone having to make an effort, let alone inflicting any hurt or deprivation on another. They arise only in our finite world of shortage and suffering, in which the gratification of our desires necessarily entails competition with others, and in which the pleasure of some is achieved only too often at the cost of the pain of others. So there has to be a situation in which everybody can't get what they want. And then that sets up the choice between altruism and selfishness, right? Which he describes in the following paragraphs. The two options, to compete or to cooperate. He says, if we compete, we shall fight for the booty, and whichever one of us proves to be the stronger will get all of it, and the other will get none. If we cooperate, we shall share it on some terms. And then he says, note here that each of these options can be expressed as a rule of conduct. Each of these statements constitutes a moral precept, and the choice of one of them in preference to the other constitutes a moral choice. Perhaps the most fundamental of all moral choices, namely whether in any given situation we should prefer selfishness or altruism. So we're not, according to his theory of ethics, and again, this is the general theory of ethics. This isn't the theory of professional ethics. This is the more general theory of ethics as a whole, that we are not really faced with a moral situation until we have to make a choice between selfishness and altruism. And that can only arise in a situation where everybody can't get what they want. And some accommodation has to be made, or by brute force, some people just get what they want over the interests of others. So that situation has to be there. That situation of everybody can't get what they want. We have competing interests, and then as an individual, you have to decide whether you're going to act selfishly or act altruistically. And to act altruistically would be to choose to put the interests of the others to some degree either above your own or at the same level. We get into some very interesting questions in general moral theory, but I hope that we understand his basic idea. Number 3, how does Sieghart conceive of the nature of the fundamental relationship between professional and client? This is of the utmost importance in Sieghart's idea of professions. And the way that he conceives of it fundamentally is that it's a situation of unequal power, the disproportionate gross inequality of power, gross disproportion of power. And all he means is that in a professional relationship, by definition, you have an asymmetry of power, where the power lies almost entirely with the professional. That's why the client or patient comes to the professional, because they have the knowledge and skills that give them, in this particular situation, regarding the health of the patient or the legal situation of the client, let's say, in terms of a lawyer, all the power, all the understanding is in this, in this one area, is with the professional, and the client is vulnerable and weak. So the fundamental nature of this relationship is the inequality of power due to the special skills and knowledge of the professional. Now, the next question, according to Sieghart, what is the basis of the duty to altruism or service on the part of the professional in his or her relationship with the client, is actually a fairly dicey question, I think, for Sieghart. That is, but it's of the utmost importance, because what he's basically saying is that the most important aspect of being professional is that with regard to your client, you are entirely altruistic. But what is the basis of that? It's actually not an easy question. I don't know if Sieghart's not a professional philosopher, so I don't think would be fair to hold him to the standards of, let's say, a professional ethicist or moral philosopher. But let's take a look at what he actually says. The key passage for Sieghart is here at the top of the first column on page 119, where he says, now the outstanding characteristic of all professions is that their members are bound, without exception or qualification, to choose the second of these modes of conduct, altruism, and not the first, selfishness. The cardinal sin of any professional, and the prime ground for his expulsion from the profession, is to prefer his own interest to that of his patient or client. In an emergency, the physician must turn out at all hours of the day or night in order to minister to his patient's needs. So must the lawyer, and so must the priest. And if we are deciding that engineering is a profession, so must the engineer. It is a grievous wrong for the physician to prescribe or perform an unnecessary procedure, or for the lawyer to advise or conduct an unnecessary lawsuit. Within a professional relationship, altruism is paramount and self-interest has no place. The professional has a duty, regardless of his own interest, to put his skills at the service of those who need them. I don't know if he's really provided a theoretical basis for the duty to altruism there. All he's really done is to claim that there is such a duty, and that the worst thing that a professional can do is to choose selfishness, which is also ambiguous. And this sort of came out in our discussion on Monday of this material. Is he saying that professionals have to do everything they can for their client? Well, when he says that doctors and lawyers need to turn out at all hours of the night, he seems to be saying that. Or is he saying simply that professionals cannot exploit their clients? And when he talks about unnecessary surgeries or unnecessary lawsuits, he seems to be indicating that. So there is some ambiguity here in terms of whether he's actually established the basis for the duty to altruism. Certainly, what he's set up in the idea of the gross inequality of power in the professional client relationship is that the professional has also all sorts of opportunities to selfishly profit by exploiting their client because of the ignorance of the client. And then he said you should never do that, because that would be to go against the fundamental principles of professional ethics. But there's something of a circularity there, I have to say. Let's pause it for a second. Sorry, I had to pause there. Let's move on. 5 describes Sieghart's idea of the noble cause. Now, he introduces this in a particular context where he's imagining this crazy scenario, page 119, about, a doctor who has a patient, and somehow or another it's this twisted hypothetical where if the doctor were to poison the enemy of his patient, then that would help his patient's health. And he's pointing out, obviously doctor couldn't do that, but why? It would help his patient, right? And then his reasons for saying, for why the doctor couldn't do it, are that the doctor has a noble cause. That is, it would violate the doctor's devotion to health in general. Even though it would help his patient, it would violate the doctor's obligation to respect and promote the health of everyone. This is at the bottom of the second column where he says the answer, I think, lies in the second criterion. The first one being altruism. The second criterion, which distinguishes a true profession from any other trade or occupation, namely that the professional serves another more general cause in addition, and in a case of conflict, superior to the cause of the well-being of his individual patients or clients. That cause is sometimes called a noble cause. And though the notion of nobility is both imprecise and currently unfashionable, the label is convenient. The idea that over and above even the devotion to individual patients or clients, there's a devotion to the fundamental idea of the profession, which is promoting health or promoting justice or promoting the welfare of the human species in terms of, say, the first canon, which is even more important and cannot be violated for the sake of a client. This is the context in which he introduces the idea. Number 6, what are Downey's particular reasons for thinking that professionals have no stricter duty to altruism than anyone else? That is actually a fairly difficult question. We'll have to look at the text. I think that the real reasoning here that Downey supplies for the claim that professionals have no greater duty to altruism than anyone else comes at the bottom of the second column of the first page, where he says, if the point is thirdly that if the point is that, morally speaking, doctors and lawyers ought not to aim at self-interest in the form of exorbitant fees, then that is true. And equally, those in other occupations ought not to aim at self-interest in the form of undue profits. That is, what he seems to be saying is that what the duty to altruism boils down to in Sieghart's theory is that this is leaning on the interpretation that what it really means is that professionals ought not to take advantage of their clients. And what Downey is saying is that, well, that's true. They ought not to do that. But nobody should take undue advantage of others in any situation. So let's say in business, you ought not to take advantage of your customers. and your business partners. So he says, in other words, there is nothing to distinguish the professional from other occupations in terms of the criteria of self-interest and altruism. The moral point is simply the one on which we can all unite. We, as a whole, ought not to be unduly self-interested. So Downey just simply doesn't buy the idea that professionals play by any other rules or should play by any other rules than the rest of us do. That they shouldn't take advantage of their clients, but no one should take advantage of anyone. Now, this is an interesting point on Downey's part, but it does. I think there's a response to it, and I think that Sieghart actually does a pretty good job in responding to it. Number 7? What are Downey's reasons for dismissing the idea of the noble cause? Well, that's pretty easily answered. He just thinks it's a useless concept because it's too widely applicable. There's no reason to think that only medicine, law, the clergy, the other so-called professions, there's no reason to think that only they have noble causes. One could say that farmers and tailors and travel agents and teachers and mailmen and police officers all have noble causes. Since there's no reason to say that these other jobs don't have noble causes, then the whole idea of a noble cause becomes too widely applicable to be definitive of the professions. So it becomes a useless concept. Now, number 8, explain Sieghart's idea in his reply to Downey that his claim about professional altruism was perceptual in nature. I find it one of the most interesting, probably the only interesting part of Sieghart's reply to Downey's reply. But I think it's pretty interesting. This is in his second point here, where he says, in saying that altruism is paramount and self-interest has no place in a professional relationship, I was, of course, not making an empirical claim. I know perfectly well, and so did my audience, that all professions have their black sheep. That is, yes, some professionals act selfishly. Of course they do. But that doesn't mean they should, right? Nor was I merely making an obvious and therefore trivial moral claim. I would, in fact, categorize my main claim as perceptual rather than conceptual. What I was trying to convey was that this was how most people in most societies expect their true professionals to behave. And I think that's a pretty strong point, actually. That is, and I often do it myself when I'm teaching this class. I say, well, what if a doctor did this? What if a doctor, would you be shocked by it? What if a lawyer did that? Would you be shocked by it? And that is, I think that I'm playing on our perceptions about the responsibilities that we do think that doctors and lawyers have. Now, whether or not they are responsibilities that are restricted to the professions, I'm not sure. But I think that Sieghart is right, that we have a perceptual bias, let's say, or prejudice that people in certain professions, that it's a bigger deal when they act unethically or selfishly or deviously or deceptively than when others do. And it's never good, but it's maybe worse. So I think that it's a pretty interesting point, this perceptual idea.